The issue of racial disparity in incarceration has received a lot of attention, especially today, and I think rightfully so. I do think the issue of how non-citizens are treated in the justice system has perhaps flown beneath the radar. And partly because we don't have a lot of information about that. If somebody comes into state court, they record their race. They don't always record their citizenship status. But in federal court, we know that. So what my colleagues and I did is said, okay, according to the letter of the law, if a non-citizen is charged with a crime and ultimately convicted, they have to be sentenced. And the same sentencing policies apply to the immigrants as to the, or the non-citizens as to the citizens. And so for the same crime, are they treated differently? And the answer appears to be yes, at least on average. If you look at the thousands of cases that we did in the late 90s and into the 2000s, that there is a, you might call it a non-citizen penalty, that for the same crime, they tend to be treated a little bit more harshly, more likely to receive a prison sentence, and if they go to prison, more likely to serve a little bit more time, or at least to be sentenced to serve a little bit more time.
Reasons for that, you think? What are some of the things you found?
That's a good question, and on that we can only speculate. Now, part of the reason, especially for the decision to send them to prison, could be related to the possibility of eventual deportation, in which they're less likely to flee, more easy to find if they're likely to be deported. But not all of those who are sentenced to prison, who are non-citizens, do get deported. Some of it may be attributable to socioeconomic status, don't have the same ability as others perhaps to find good legal counsel. And some of it may be to just more apathy about what happens to non-citizens, or it may, this is a time in which there's a lot of anxiety or even anger about immigration. Judges are pretty well trained, and I think they're willing to take a second look at what they're doing and try to be responsible. So to some extent, knowledge is power. And if they're not aware that this trend is going on or that non-citizens are being treated more harshly, then just being aware of it could make some difference. Second is, and this I think the Justice Department and the judicial branch has much less control over, I don't know if anybody has control over it, is how do we change the public mood about immigrants? And so immigrants tend to make the headlines when bad things happen, but they also do a lot of good things too. So, my wife is an immigrant and works pretty hard and pays taxes and so on, is well educated. And there are many, if you look at some of our major advances in the tech industry, including Google, for example, these were immigrants that made contributions. And so I think until that narrative changes and we realize that immigrants bring a lot of good as well as, of course, sometimes crimes as well. But until that narrative changes a bit, it's going to be hard to ratchet down that disparity. The number of mass shootings, such as San Bernardino, for example, and other cases in which those make the headlines and they're in the headlines for a long time, and that draws the public's attention, and naturally they would become more concerned about crime, even if the overall crime rate has stayed relatively stable. A second is it could be a little bit of a function of the primary season. Crime was in the news more, especially with some politicians, Trump, for example, talking about immigration and Mexican Americans and crime. At least for some segments of the population, that may increase their awareness of it. And actually, if you dig into the numbers on that Gallup poll, you find that the proportion that sees crime as becoming more of a concern is pretty concentrated within that group that has less than a college education. So those are some of the reasons why I think, if I could add one more item about that, the question looks very different, or the responses look very different if you just ask people, what are the major concerns that you have in America today? Crime falls pretty low right now. The economy, healthcare, environment, immigration, those are all towards the top. We only see that pattern with crime emerge when they're specifically asked about the crime problem, when they're prompted for it. But if you don't mention it, if you just ask an open-ended question, people tend to point to other things as more important. Legally, there is the option that district attorneys have to treat these cases differently and prosecute them as hate crimes, which would usually lead to a more severe penalty. In practice, there are very few hate crime prosecutions, especially outside of a couple of cities that have really made a concerted effort to take these crimes very seriously. New York City stands out as one example there. But hate crimes are very difficult cases to prosecute for all sorts of reasons. For one, it's difficult enough to prove a motive, right, beyond a reasonable doubt, but then to prove that that motive had that specific hatred as what Joe, but for that hatred, the crime would not have happened. You almost need an overt statement or something. Also, some, especially with respect to sexual orientation, some may not be comfortable mentioning that. They may not want to make an issue of it for fear of other reprisal or of coming out, or if others don't know of their sexual orientation. So just the reporting of the crimes to begin with is very unreliable.